Hello, everybody, and welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about English sentence structure. So we're going to build on everything that we learned in the parts of speech lesson and start to dive in a little deeper, okay? So let's get started. So after finishing this lesson, you will be able to understand what a sentence is, know what makes a complete sentence, understand clauses and their types, understand how clauses work together, identify and use conjunctions, and start writing some complex sentences correctly on your own. All right, so now that we've covered objects and complements and we're starting to understand the structure of sentences, what is a sentence anyway? A sentence contains a subject, which we've already covered, and the predicate, okay? So the subject is the noun or the pronoun that is performing the action, and the predicate is the verb and an optional description of what the subject is doing or how they are doing it. So basically, you can think of it as the subject, and then the predicate is just the rest of the sentence. Okay, so what is a sentence anyway? Well, at minimum, a sentence must have a subject, a verb, and a complete thought that makes sense by itself. So the cat meowed, that's a complete sentence because it has a subject, a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. The statue fell, that's a complete sentence as well because we have a subject with a verb and it's a complete thought. The last two, however, in the ocean, there's no verb there, okay? There's also not a subject, it's just a place. Then we have running very fast, that's just a verb with adverbs, okay? But there's no subject, and neither actually expresses a complete thought. So neither of those are complete sentences. All right, now let's talk about clauses, because clauses are really going to be the building blocks of sentences. They're what we will use over and over and over again as we start to write longer and more advanced sentences. So the combination of a subject and a verb in a group of words is called a clause. There are two main types of clauses. We have independent clauses and dependent clauses, all right? An independent clause expresses a complete thought and can stand alone as a complete sentence on its own, all right? So, for example, John is at home. This has a subject, it has a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. So now you can see that actually the minimum requirement for a sentence is to have one clause that expresses a complete thought. A dependent clause also contains a subject and a verb, but it doesn't form a complete thought. Because it doesn't form a complete thought, therefore, it cannot be a sentence on its own. So for example, Sally is not. Okay, this is not a correct sentence because it doesn't form a complete thought. It is a clause, but it cannot stand as a sentence on its own, okay? It's not a complete thought. Sally's not what? Sally is not where. It doesn't make any sense. Dependent clauses are called dependent because they depend on an independent clause to give them meaning. So, for example, if we combine the independent and dependent clauses from the previous two examples, John is home, but Sally is not, the independent clause here could be taken out and still live on its own as a complete sentence. So John is home could be taken out and it's still a complete sentence because it forms a complete thought. But the dependent clause, Sally is not, could not survive on its own without the independent clause because it doesn't form a complete thought. So again, the dependent clause depends on the independent clause. All right, I hope that makes sense. So just a couple more examples of this. We have, I went home and John did too. Okay, if we had John did too by itself, it wouldn't make sense. We'd say John did what too, okay? And the same goes for the next one. My car isn't running, but Lucy's was, okay? So if we just had but Lucy's was, we'd say Lucy's was what, all right? It wouldn't make any sense. But because both of these are attached to independent clauses, they are just fine in these sentences as they are. Now, if you remember in the parts of speech lesson, I talked about conjunctions, okay? Well, this is where those conjunctions come in and are so important, right? So conjunctions are used to combine clauses together to make sentences and complete thoughts, right? So some examples: and, but, so, because, however. So if we say, I think it will work, but I don't know, we're using but to combine these two clauses. All right, let's talk about relative clauses now. So a relative clause is a type of dependent clause that gives extra information about a noun or pronoun in the independent clause in the subject of a sentence. Relative clauses start with a relative pronoun like who, which, that, or whose. An example would be, the t-shirt I was wearing at the time, which I had only bought the day before, wasn't an option because I had spilled pizza sauce on it, okay? So you see, we're giving extra information about the subject of the sentence. Now, with relative clauses, we have two types. We have defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses. The shirt I was wearing at the time, which I only bought yesterday, wasn't an option because I had spilled pizza sauce on it. This one doesn't actually change the subject of the sentence, right? It only adds extra information. So we call this a non-defining relative clause because it doesn't define what the subject is. It just adds extra information to the subject. Now in the second example, but luckily the other shirt that I bought yesterday was also in my bag. In this one, we actually change what the subject is. If we look at this sentence, if we want to figure out what the subject is, it wouldn't be the other shirt because that wouldn't be the shirt we're talking about. We're talking about the other shirt that I bought yesterday. That's the whole subject of the sentence now. So because we're now changing the subject of the sentence with this relative clause, that makes it a defining relative clause, okay? So for the first one, we just add some extra information that makes it non-defining. And in the second one, we actually change what the subject is, okay? We are defining what the subject is. So the key question we have to ask ourselves in that situation: does it change the subject or does it just add extra information? So now some more clause examples. A non-defining would be, my friend Julie, who loves antiquing, helped me find all these cool things. But if we said, my friend who loves antiquing helped me find all these cool things, that's now a defining clause because the whole subject is my friend who loves antiquing. Next example, non-defining, the newest Lamborghini, which my friend just bought, by the way, is the most expensive car in the world. A defining clause would be, the car my friend just bought is the most expensive car in the world. Okay, so again, here we're defining the subject as the car that my friend just bought. All right, we're not adding extra information, we're actually changing the subject of the sentence. So why does all this matter? If you've taken many lessons or courses from me, by now you should know that it's not really my style to overload you with tons of grammar and stuff that doesn't really matter when you're speaking and writing English. In this case, as we continue learning more and more about English sentence structure, you're going to realize that all of these things are actually very important to know when you want to speak and write proper English. Especially if you want to write things like letters, emails, reports, proposals, anything more than just a simple text message, you're going to need to learn what's in these upcoming lessons, okay? The reason why is because we have different rules in sentences for different types of clauses and how we make sentences with them. We also have different types of conjunctions for different types of sentences. And to communicate advanced ideas and meanings, we'll need to be able to make longer sentences with proper sentence structure using all of these rules. So, in the next lesson, we'll cover these different types of sentences and how to build more advanced sentences using different clauses and conjunctions. We'll also learn important rules for commas so that we can make our sentences error-free. All right, let's summarize everything we've learned in this lesson so far. So a sentence must have at least one clause, all right, which is a subject and a verb, and it must form a complete thought. A dependent clause cannot survive on its own, okay? It needs an independent clause to have meaning. An independent clause can survive on its own, and it gives meaning to the dependent clause. We combine clauses with conjunctions to make sentences with complex meaning. Okay, practice time once again. With these 5 examples, I want you to identify the independent clause and then what is the dependent clause in each sentence. You don't have to write it down somewhere separately this time if you don't want to, but you need to look at each sentence and then decide which one is the independent clause and which one is the dependent clause, okay? So I'll go ahead and read through these and show them to you, and then you can pause the video, answer them on your own, and then unpause, and I'll come back and give you the answers. So the first one, John kicked the ball to Sally, but she missed. Alejandro saw everything, but I didn't. John is not here, he's there. The PlayStation is broken, but the Nintendo is not. The cat tried to scratch the dog, but she ran. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video, go through these, identify the independent and dependent clause, then unpause me and I'll give you the answers and explain everything a little bit. So go ahead and pause me now. All right, you should have already paused me and unpaused me. So let's start with the first one. John kicked the ball to Sally, but she missed, okay? Independent clause, we have the subject, the verb, John, subject, verb, kicked. The ball is the object. And then we have Sally, the indirect object that he kicked it to. Independent clause, that could live on its own. John kicked the ball to Sally. That's a complete thought, right? But she missed, that's dependent. If we took it out, it couldn't be in a sentence on its own, right? So independent clause, John kicked the ball to Sally. Dependent clause, but she missed. Alejandro saw everything, but I didn't. Again, I didn't. If that was by itself, we would say I didn't what? So therefore, it's a dependent clause, can't stay on its own, right? So here, Alejandro saw everything is the independent clause, but I didn't, dependent clause. John is not here, he's there. John is not here, complete thought, can live on its own, independent clause. He's there, dependent clause, okay? The PlayStation is broken, but the Nintendo is not. The Nintendo is not what? That would be the key question we would have to ask ourselves there, right? So it wouldn't make sense on its own. It can't live without the PlayStation is broken, all right? The last one, the cat tried to scratch the dog, but she ran, okay? Again, the cat tried to scratch the dog, period, complete sentence all by itself. But she ran, conjunction is but, she ran is the dependent clause, okay? So hopefully this wasn't too difficult. If it was, feel free to go back and rewatch the lesson to get a little bit more clarity on which type of clause is which and why before you move on. All right, that's it. Another lesson complete. In the next lesson, we're going to start putting all of this together in a way that's going to make it much easier for you to start writing longer, more advanced sentences in an error-free way that's very easy for you to remember and understand. So go get started on your guided practice, and I will see you in the next lesson.